Last year, my husband and I bought our first home. We consider ourselves extremely lucky. After a year of searching in multiple cities, dozens of failed offers, and in some incredibly demoralizing house hunting, we finally got one. I know that our frustrating experience with trying to buy a house isn't unique for most millennials. This is the time where many of us are getting married and wanting to start a family. But the thing we want most, our own home, is completely out of reach. The main reason why it is so difficult and hyper-competitive to find a reasonably priced home is because of the law of supply and demand. The supply of housing is very low, while the demand for housing is very high. This creates a pressure cooker housing market that leaves most buyers in the dust. I know that many people feel like the housing market is something that is happening to them and is totally out of their control. I am here to tell you that there are things our government can do to actually change the market. We just need to hold them accountable for making real change and prioritizing getting people into homes they own instead of rent. Housing experts have found that improving affordable home ownership leads to greater economic stability, access to quality education, increased civic and social engagement, better health, and a reduced environmental footprint. Did you know that those who own where they live have an average net wealth that is 400% higher than that of renters? Or that home equity represents the largest proportion of wealth for U.S. households, with home equity representing an even larger share of net wealth for low-income households and Black and Hispanic households? Increasing our home ownership opportunities is the #1 way to break generational cycles of poverty and inequity. This is why increasing home ownership should be the #1 priority of the state of Oregon. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we see such a low supply of housing in Oregon, why we have a demand boom, and some of the things we could do in our state to make it easier to build affordable housing. Let's talk first about supply, or the lack thereof. Across the nation, the supply of housing is low. We can look back to the economic recession of 2008 as one of the major disruptors to housing supply. But in Oregon, things are especially bad, and our problems started way before 2008. Recent studies have found that Oregon has been chronically underbuilding housing for decades, despite continued population growth since the 1970s. Currently, Oregon has a backlog of nearly 140,000 housing units, and we need to produce over 540,000 new homes by 2040 to adequately house our current population. To do this, we would need to double the number of homes our builders can currently produce each year. But there are many barriers impacting housing development, especially affordable housing development. These issues range from workforce shortages to skyrocketing price of materials to the regulatory barriers our laws can create. For this video, we're going to focus on the latter, but let's talk quickly about demand. Demand for housing is extremely high for a number of reasons, including millennials and Gen Z entering prime home buying age. The pandemic also shifted buyer preferences. Having kids and adults at home during the workday meant that people wanted out of apartments or starter homes and into larger homes with more multifunctional spaces. Despite the pandemic being generally over, we still see more people working from home and eyeing the suburbs as their ideal place to live. We have also seen both record low interest rates, which cause a boom in the buyers on the market, and then a spike in interest rates, which diluted their purchasing power. For every 1% increase in interest rates, your buying power decreases by about 10%. So for example, if you can spend $1,800 per month on a mortgage and could put 20% down, you could buy a home for $440,000 with a 4.5% interest rate. But if that rate increased to 5.5%, the maximum home price you could now afford is only $395,000. These figures don't include the amount of property taxes or insurance. The rapid change in interest rates in the last 18 months has resulted in a shrinking population of millennials who can afford to pay a mortgage, even for a modest starter home. But it isn't stopping them from still buying. The reality is that many buyers are simply increasing their monthly cost burden because there is really no guarantee that things will get better in the near future. Okay, so let's recap. We have extremely low production, which has caused a significant undersupply of housing, with an influx of buyers on the market, ultimately making it a hyper-competitive market, which is inflating the price of homes well beyond their fair market value. To top it off, because of high interest rates, homebuyer purchasing power has been diluted. making the cost of housing even more out of reach. You're probably thinking, okay, I get it. So why don't they just build more affordable housing? Great question, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. There is a reason why builders can only build about 20,000 homes a year, which, remember, that number needs to double if we want to overcome our housing backlog. This is also a reason why affordable housing is even more difficult to build than higher-end homes. It all comes down to my least favorite subject, math. If you take one thing away from this video, it's this. Building affordable housing is not a will problem, it's a math problem. A house is just a product, just like any other product. To create that product, there are inputs that increase the overall cost of the product. Let's take something simple like a cake. A cake shop has to cover the cost of ingredients, baking equipment, the baker's wages for their time, packaging, and marketing. If all of those costs add up to, say, $50, the bakery is not going to be able to sell their cake for less than $50. If people in their market can't afford a $50 cake, that cake shop isn't baking those cakes. A house is the same. If the overall cost of the housing project greatly outweigh the price that buyers or renters can afford, the housing isn't going to be built. This is what housing developers mean when they say the project doesn't pencil. As we said before, there are some things that we can do to boost affordable housing supply. Today, I'm going to talk about two things OPOA has been advocating for: increasing our buildable land supply and reducing risk of appeal for needed housing development. Oregon has an extremely limited supply of land available for housing, and it's entirely self-inflicted. Unlike the other 49 states, Oregon has turned most planning and zoning decisions over to the state government instead of local cities and counties. The state, through their statutes and rules, has required almost all land in Oregon to be off limits for urban uses. In fact, less than 1% of Oregon's land is available for housing, while nearly 97% of land is available for farming and forestry uses. Remember our lesson on supply and demand? Given the artificial land shortage and the overwhelming demand for land zone for housing, what little land is available is astronomically expensive. Now remember that cake? Dirt is the first ingredient in building a home. If the cost of buying the dirt is extremely expensive, on top of all the other costs to develop the land and build the house, the builder cannot build an affordable housing product. This is why OPOA has been advocating for changing the laws that dictate how our communities include more land in their urban growth boundaries for housing. We need to make it easier, faster, and less expensive for cities to include more land in their boundary zone for housing. We also need to make it easier for cities to rezone land from other uses to residential, or simply allow residential uses in other zones. Some cities have enough land in their boundaries already, but that land can't be built because it contains wetlands or other environmental features. Other lands simply are not serviced by infrastructure like water, sewer, or roads. We need to change the law to make it easier and less expensive for cities and builders to get land in existing boundaries shovel-ready. And for a period of time, the state needs to help foot the costs. The other issues impacting affordable housing development is the maze of bureaucracy that Oregon has created for property owners wishing to build a home. Oregon has a history of encouraging public activism and involvement in state and local affairs. While well-intentioned, Oregon laws completely overvalue citizen involvement in planning decisions, resulting in a decline in housing applications and a process that discourages property owners from applying to build new housing. Oregon law requires a local hearing process for nearly all housing applications, from the replacement of an existing home to a large subdivision. Neighborhood meetings, complicated land use applications, multi-level local reviews, and public hearings at each local level are hallmarks of Oregon's system. This process encourages NIMBYism and activist groups to take full advantage of the opportunity to stop affordable housing development. Want to find out what your neighbors really think of you? Apply to build a duplex on your property and you'll find out quick whether they are really your friends. But we're just getting started. Not only is the local review process a tangled quagmire of bureaucracy and NIMBY interference, Oregon has managed to create a multi-level court review of any local land use decision. For very little cost and with no risk to having to pay attorney's fees should they lose, local activists appeal any local decision with an outcome they dislike. There really isn't a reason not to, since they face no risk if their appeal is unsuccessful, regardless of how frivolous. In the meantime, the delay caused by the dedicated group of NIMBYs kills projects that meet all the criteria for approval. Building a project costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why would a builder risk that kind of capital to build a project that may face years of needless delays from local activist groups when they can invest that capital in another state where it's easier to build? And if they do spend the capital on a risky Oregon project, you know darn well the cost of delay will be added to the end of the cost of the home. Another key takeaway from today: time is money. The longer the delay to get project approval, the more expensive the homes will be. OPOA has been working to change the law to reduce opportunities for NIMBYs to delay needed housing projects. We believe that if your property is zoned for residential use and you want to build a home on it, you should be able to do so with no local government involvement or public hearings. We also believe that if you sue to stop a housing project and you lose, you should have to pay the attorney's fees of the property owner who did everything right. When you add these factors together, it's no wonder why it's harder than ever for millennials to buy homes. Very few politicians at any level are treating this as a crisis, but they should. At OPOA, we're fighting daily to solve our housing crisis, and we would love your help. Please subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media to stay up to date on how you can take action when the time comes. In the meantime, please reach out to your elected official and ask them to make housing production their priority this year. If you have any questions about what you learned today or are interested in hosting an OPOA educational event in your community, please reach out to us.